Awesome. Well, Colin, thanks for hopping on. I sent over the list of questions ahead of time, and I've been listening to your videos in the background while I work, and I've got to say, like after a certain point, I realized that it's like ASMR for me. Like your voice and the way you do your audio, it works really gosh darn well, and you get like always get the shot of you like specifically like pulling the part out just perfect. The way that I never can when I'm working on things without
You have
snapping
no
off
idea how
cuts.
many times I have to do those shots, how many takes
That's what I was thinking.
are
I imagine
required.
because all
Oh,
the
yeah.
stuff you work on, like
Oh, yeah.
it's that old stuff that's just so prone to cracking. And oh my
Mhm.
goodness, nice. All right, well let me get my list up here. I'm gonna start out with just kind of a generic bio question here. So I'm curious, like how and when you kind of got started working on like hardware stuff in particular.
Just like modding and retro and all that. Um, it was probably about 10 years ago that I really kind of got involved in it as a dedicated hobby. I'd been kind of tinkering for many years prior, just here and there. But for the most part, I kind of got to this point where retro video games, it was up and coming, right? Because you think like early 2000s, nobody cared about retro video games or retro anything, right? But about 10 years ago, I'm like, I remember playing NES with like my friends, my neighbors as a kid, and I never had an original NES console. I'm an adult now. They're not that expensive. I'm going to go buy one. And that sort of thing. And I always wanted an original Game Boy, or I wanted this, or I wanted that. And my story is definitely not unique in that regard. That's largely what's been driving the rise in retro. But obviously, with the equipment being as old as it is, it's not necessarily going to work perfectly right off the bat. Or if it does, that means someone else has already gone through and fixed it up, and it's going to be priced appropriately. So I wanted to get into it as kind of a less expensive hobby because I wanted to experience kind of a breadth of it, right? What were the game consoles and stuff that I never got to experience as a kid or didn't get one of my own, that sort of thing. Even with as cheap as prices were at the time, I needed to set a budget. So I figured, okay, well, this stuff can't be that hard. And I had started getting into watching YouTube around that time, and I found a bunch of other really good channels that talked about modding and fixing up retro game consoles. And I'd watch those videos and I'd be like, that's actually not that hard. I can do this. So, it kind of turned into that hobby of like, let's go to thrift stores and whatever, try to find some of these consoles. And if they're in working shape, cool. If they're not, there's kind of a fledgling repair industry out there to get replacement parts and whatnot, and decent amount of information about how to fix this stuff. And let's just do it. And it just kind of snowballed from there. And, now, of course, it's turned into, well, retro audio and retro computers and all that other kind of stuff too. But I think getting my start with something that was very commodity. They just made millions of Game Boys, right? So they're not hard to find. And that means it's not hard to find information about them. If you have a problem with a Game Boy, someone else has had that problem. You are never the first person to have that problem. You will find an answer to whatever it is, that you're facing. So that just made it really easy to get into as I developed skills, got better at, soldering and doing small repairs and that sort of stuff. And just kind of continuing on from there.
Nice. Awesome. So would you say it kind of seems like in a lot of the it seems like would you say that a lot of it kind of like a lot of the stuff that you work on kind of is almost based out of like a nostalgia for a certain era almost because there seems to be a particular era of
Mm-hmm.
technology that you showcase on your channel a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's generally, and I think this is true for almost everyone, it's generally going to be centered around your childhood, right? What did you grow up around? And it's going to be either the stuff that you experienced that got away from you and you want to experience it again, which is a very popular thing, right? people, they sell off their old game systems and come back 20, 30 years later as an adult and they're nostalgic for it. Oh, I remember when I was a kid and I played Super Mario World and I want to have a Super NES again and that sort of thing. The other one is stuff you missed out on. Maybe you were a Nintendo household, but you never got into the Sega stuff. I always wondered what Sonic and, Sega and the Genesis and the Saturn and all that was like. And well, now you can go out and buy that stuff. So I think it generally tracks with your childhood. There are some people who have a genuine affinity for stuff that predates them. I've got a couple of friends who are around my age, but they love computers from the 70s, like really old stuff, older than they are, and getting into that history and that sort of thing. There definitely are people who do that, but I think that's far less common. So in my case, I generally center around stuff from kind of the late 80s through the 90s and maybe starting to get into the early 2000s a bit.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah, I see a lot of similarities to like kind of like the collector car and fixing up old cars world. Obviously, I do a lot of stuff with that. And what I can get right now, you get cheap cars from the 90s because they're still cheap. You can find some beaters that are, it's still a cool car, and you can work to fix it up. So it's kind of this interesting nexus of where your nostalgia hits and if the cost is right at the right time. That tends to go with it. Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and I don't think retro is necessarily like what we're seeing with retro tech is necessarily something unique to retro tech. I think this is just the evolution of collecting in general. Like you brought up retro cars. People who have gone through retro cars, it's the exact same thing that we're going through with retro tech right now. It's just that retro cars as a concept have been around a lot longer just because cars have been around a lot longer. Like there are people who are really into cars from the 50s and the 60s and that sort of thing. Well, video games didn't really exist back then. So it's kind of taken a little while for retro tech as a concept to catch up. But I see huge similarities between basically anyone who's into a collecting type hobby and the vintage paraphernalia that comes along with it, any sort of repairs or mods or upgrades that they want to do. And even not just, repairing old stuff back to the way it was, but now the modern parts you can buy. In the automotive world, we'd call it resto mods, right? Where you take an old classic car body and drop a brand new modern engine and powertrain into it to make it better than it ever was before. And we're absolutely seeing the same thing going on with not just retro video games, which is kind of where it started in the tech circles, but now retro computing as well. Just that cottage industry of, just passionate people coming up with these really, really cool things to take this old stuff and continue to push it forward.
Awesome. Nice. Yeah, I think there's a ton of that. And like the resto modding stuff in particular, that's even a little bit like I gotta show you this is the retro computing thing that I've gotten so far. I got a lot of 3 almost functioning ThinkPad X61s off eBay.
Oh, nice.
And I really want to get this one working once I find a decent battery for it. But this is the X61 tablet, and so
nice.
You can flip the screen completely around. And it's got the little pen that pops out at the bottom. But just little things like that. Like there's an interesting... It seems in hindsight almost confined to a specific era or anything else. But like I'd say almost mechanical solutions to problems that would just be completely solved digitally nowadays.
Yep. Oh, yeah. You take apart any sort of like vintage audio equipment, and you look at just all the gears and intricate physical mechanisms inside something like an old tape deck. And in some ways, it's just kind of mind-boggling that this was in an era before they really had CAD. So it's not like you're having a computer solve the problem for you. You've had like this team of people that sit there with pen and paper drawing out all these little parts and how they can hook up to each other to achieve, the physical movement or whatever. it seemed like technology now is really weird in that it's amazing in what it can do, right? Just beyond what we could have even imagined probably just a decade ago. But it also seems super easy now. Like, of course, this thing can talk to this other thing and that sort of stuff. And then you look at something purely mechanical, like a cassette deck or even a mechanical watch, and you just look at the intricacy in there, excuse me, and all the tiny parts. And then you realize they did that all by hand. Like, how were people that smart back then to be able to pull that off? It's just, it gives you a real appreciation for the lengths people had to go to decades ago just to do what they wanted to do. Whereas, yeah, like you said, today, it would just be a couple of lines of code in software and then you're done.
Mm-hmm. Yep. There's definitely something to be said for an almost, excuse me, like an almost beautiful simplicity in some of the old designs and what they do. Like, for example, like my father-in-law has he loves old VW Beetles, so he has a '67 Beetle, and the heat for the Beetle was literally just one lever that you'd run underneath, and normally the heat would travel through channels underneath kind of the side panels and would come up, and it was just a simple flap and lever system for it that would go out, and oftentimes it'll be like, oh, the heat went out on my Beetle. It's like, well, that's because your body's rusting, and they just had it was just running through those panels, so you might
the
not
heat's
get it
escaping
back.
outside before it gets to you. Yeah,
Exactly. So there's some to be said for some of that simplicity that that just doesn't seem present anymore. I like that. All right, let me see here. Oh yeah, so I'm curious because I'm just starting to get into those ThinkPads, and I've done a few things like I've swapped in some like an SSD hard drive that I bounced into one, and I did I can't even remember what it's called, but basically the firmware upgrade to allow you to like use a different Wi-Fi card and
oh sure, yep,
open up
remove
for
the
SATA 2
whitelist and all
instead of
that.
SATA 1.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
I'm curious, like what does kind of your cleaning repair toolkit look like for something like this? Because the next step for me on a couple of these ThinkPads is to take them completely apart, clean out all the dust, and see what I can get out of there because they're pretty filthy.
Oh yeah, yeah. Especially if it's like former corporate use stuff, because the people who used them didn't care. The thing that I tell everybody, the first important tool you should buy is just a really good set of screwdrivers. And don't get a random mishmash, of stuff, and don't go out to the garage and try to make tools work that aren't designed to work. The kind of screwdrivers that you would use to like hang a picture aren't necessarily the same kind of screws that they use to hold, intricate electronics together. And what really sucks is there have actually been a few different standards for things that look like Phillips head screws. Right, you've got Phillips head screws, you've got posi drive screws, and you've got JIS screws. If you don't know how to tell the difference, and it's really difficult sometimes, you're going to be using the wrong driver on the wrong screw, and then you're going to strip it out, and then you're going to get frustrated, and then you're going to get turned off to the whole thing. So go out and get a really good set of like electronics focused, screwdriver kit. It can be the interchangeable bit kind, or it can be just a whole bunch of individual screwdrivers. Definitely recommend, an assortment of Phillips and flathead, and of course JIS and posi drive and all those, plus Torx. You're going to see a lot of Torx bit screws in electronics. And companies like iFixit, and they're not the only ones, but they're one of the more popular brands. They've got lots of good, electronics repair toolkits kind of put together for you. So expect to spend somewhere between like 40 and 50 bucks for a really good set with a nice assortment. They're going to include some of the more esoteric bits, some of which you think you may never use until years down the road. You're taking apart this one thing and suddenly it's, oh, geez, it's that screw. I've never seen that before. Oh, look, I've got that bit. And you save the day. So definitely start with a really good solid screwdriver kit. Beyond that, for cleaning, I've found that just compressed air or, shop vac, something like that can take care of the big dust bunnies. For really detailed cleaning, I like to use alcohol prep pads. You can get them from the pharmacy. It's the kind of thing that they use like when they wipe your arm before they give you a shot. They're medical use, but they're basically just like little pieces of fabric that are impregnated with isopropyl alcohol and packaged up like a wet wipe. So they're really useful for if you just need to get in kind of a nook or cranny or whatever. You can wrap it around the end of like a plastic, what they call a spudger, to kind of give it a crease, and then that can help you get into corners and that sort of thing. Larger scale, maybe, a bottle of isopropyl alcohol and some paper towels can be useful. For cleaning the outside of electronics, I've just found like general all-purpose cleaner to work really well. And paper towels again, of course. Maybe get a bottle of glass cleaner if you're working with monitors and screens and that sort of thing. Like I said, their spudgers are really, really useful. They look kind of like a flathead screwdriver, but they're wider on one end and they're made out of this mix of plastic and Teflon. So they're kind of flexible, but also still kind of stiff. The important thing is that material is generally softer than anything else you're going to work on. So that's what helps you pry apart seams in plastic cases and stuff like that if you need to get a housing taken apart. But it keeps you from marking up the edge. And that's a real rookie thing that people will do is they'll look at like they're taking apart their Game Boy and they take out all the screws and maybe there's enough kind of, just crap that gets in that gap between the two halves and it's stuck together. So what do? They reach for a small flathead screwdriver and they jam it in there and they start prying. And next thing you know, you've got it all chewed out, right? A spudger is a really good tool to use for that because it basically won't damage the surface. And it's also good for scraping and all sorts of other stuff, holding down components if you're soldering. So, those plastic spudgers are really useful. If you start getting more into repairs, like component level repairs, and not just taking stuff apart to clean it, like if you want to get into Game Boy modding or installing some of the more like esoteric computing mods or getting into replacing the capacitors on motherboards and that sort of thing, which is a skill that pretty much everyone's going to have to learn at some point just because of the rate at which they fail. Then you're going to want to look into investing in something like a soldering iron, and all the bits and pieces that go with that, solder and flux and a good pair of tweezers and good lighting or a magnifying glass. Some people that get really into the recapping work will invest in a microscope and a hot air station. Some of that stuff can be really expensive. Some of it actually can be more affordable than you think. It all just kind of comes down to the quality that you expect. But if just like a basic soldering kit with all the bits and pieces that you need, budget somewhere between like 60 and $70 for something that's good enough quality to get you started and won't make you frustrated with, how bad the tool performs or whatever. I mean, you can buy a soldering iron for $10, but I'm of the mindset where in general, it pays to invest a bit better in tools than just buying the cheap thing. Some people say, well, always buy the cheapest thing and then when you wear it out, you can upgrade to a new one. If it's a tool you don't use very often at all, that may make sense. But if it's a key thing that you're going to use over and over again, spend a couple more bucks. You don't have to go buy the most expensive by any means, but I wouldn't buy, the $10 soldering iron. I'd pony up for something that's like $40. You'll have a much better experience. And especially as you learn how to use those tools, it'll again make you less frustrated, because I think that's what turns a lot of people off to this hobby is they get all excited about it. They learn as much as they can about, what they need to do to get started. They buy some tools, but they just buy whatever's the cheapest thing they can find on Amazon or eBay or whatever. And then they sit down, okay, I'm finally going to do this repair, and they just make an absolute dog's breakfast of the thing. Because, yeah, they're learning how to use the tools as they go, but the tools are fighting them the whole time. That's just my opinion on it.
Nice. Yeah, you're going over the budget items, and this is kind of actually why I started doing this. I figure, I got to distract myself from working on cars because you get a tool for working on a car or a part for a car, and you'll double the whole budget compared to
Oh
grabbing
yeah.
an old ThinkPad and hacking away at it. And it
Yeah.
scratched that same itch for me. So
Well, and the thing about retro anything is you can decide how far into it you want to go. Like even like say cars, whatever, right? Like you can say, you know what, this is what I'm comfortable with at my skill level. And anything that's harder than that, then I'll either get someone else to do, or maybe I'll just pass that project along to someone else or whatever, right? There are plenty of shade tree mechanics who restore cars but don't tear the engine all the way down and rebuild it themselves, right? They're like, you know what? I don't know how to put this engine back together, even if I can take it apart. I'm going to send it off to a shop and let the experts do that part. But I know how to put it back into the chassis when it comes back, and you just kind of pick how far you want to go with it. And that can help define what tools you need to get as well. Yeah, if you get into computers from the 90s that have bad capacitors on motherboards, that may be a hurdle, but there are people out there who will repair that as a service for you. So you can do everything else. You can clean it out. You can upgrade it. Maybe you're comfortable swapping out the hard drive or doing this other mod or whatever, but you just haven't gotten the soldering skills down just yet or something like that. We're at the point where there are so many people that have also gotten into that hobby. There are others out there who can not just give you information, but also help you, either for free or as a paid service.
awesome. All right, let me see here. Oh, I just had a question lined up. Which one was it here? Oh yeah, I'm curious. So I was watching a bunch of your videos, obviously, and I suppose that this is definitely going to depend on what it is. But do you find that um, almost as like a daily drive or something like that, how much of your retro stuff do you end up like being able to use, kind of reasonably often?
Like on a regular basis? Sad to say it's relatively little. Mostly because a lot of what I've gotten into is fairly esoteric. You know, the just kind of the nature of creating content for YouTube, you need to come up with stuff that's fresh fairly often. So if I just kept doing the same repair over and over and over again, not only would I get bored doing that, but my audience would get bored doing that. I can't just keep doing the same screen replacement in a Game Boy week after week after week. So it kind of takes you down this path of finding really weird, obscure tech to show off and then researching its history and that sort of thing. And sometimes there's a repair involved and sometimes there's not. So lately, at least, I've often been ended up with stuff that really isn't practical for daily use or frequent use, just because it was intended for a very niche use case when it was new that is absolutely just not valid at all today. But retro gaming always has appeal. Every once in a while I will pull out an old Game Boy and just fire up Tetris or whatever. It's just a quick and easy thing to do to burn a couple of minutes if you need a break at work or whatever. And especially with a game like Tetris, where there's really no commitment, you don't feel compelled. Oh, just one more level, just one more level. You can drop it at any time and come back later. The other thing that I've also been really getting back into, because I never really left it, is the mini disc audio format. I got into that in the mid to late 90s. Kind of fell away from it as MP3s and the iPod and all that kind of took over. But there's been this really interesting, quiet resurgence in that format among some indie music labels and some specific music genres. And so that's kind of rekindled my interest in that format. So every once in a while, I'll pull out one of my portable mini disc players and drop in a disc and listen to that instead of firing up Spotify or whatever. And it's equal parts like discovering something new, like it's new music that I may be listening to, but it's also that nostalgia hit because it takes me right back to, almost 30 years ago when I had this thing and, taking it with me to school or whatever, throw my mini disc player in the pocket of my backpack and listen to it on the bus or something like that. So it's nice when you get that kind of that, old and new out of something retro, when the community has helped push it along where you're not just stuck in that time capsule. We're starting to see that with retro gaming too, where people are actually writing new games for old hardware. And so that's, I think, what will ultimately help kind of keep that stuff fresh and push it along. You don't feel like you're always playing the same games over and over again, or listening to the same music over and over again, just like with vinyl, right? You know, vinyl's an old format, but look at how many brand new records that they're selling now. It's neat to see that kind of dichotomy between both new and old at the same time. And especially if you see younger folks who are getting into it for the first time, some of them will end up with this appreciation for the past, you know, for the history or whatever. Some of it just see it as, oh, this is this cool thing that my parents did, and I don't quite understand it, but it seems cool to me, you know, and they'll kind of fumble about using it. But other people really dig the historical aspect to some of this tech. And for me, what I really like is looking at how retro tech fit into everything else. The history for me is almost as interesting as the actual technology and how it works and how it was put together. Because a lot of this stuff I've learned is really interconnected. You know, one product led to the creation of another product, and maybe that first product was a failure, but there was some part of it that was really good. And that company tried again, and the second try was a big success. And that's what everyone remembered. And maybe it died off, but there was some part of it still that lingered on and sparked an idea that someone else had to make something else. So I'm finding that it's really kind of all interconnected as you dig through the history. And it's neat to see how technology from 20, 30 plus years ago influenced where we are now.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that's probably one of the things I have to say that I probably like most about watching one of your videos is just the you get a lot of like the historical context. There's a bit of a narrative that comes in when you've done all this, and some of this research. You know, you bring up pictures from like ads and pamphlets from that time period and everything, and you bring it up, and it just does a really good job adding a lot of context around and keeping it super interesting. I was curious, what is your kind of your research process look like for getting a lot of that historical context?
You know, it's just kind of all over the place. I've found that I learn as I go through the process of creating a video. It's not a very structured process. In the very beginning, when I started creating videos, I felt like it had to be. Right? Where I'd be like, okay, first I'm going to do the research, and then I'm going to write the script, and then I'm going to shoot the footage, and I'm going to shoot the footage in the order of the script, and then I'm going to edit, the video and put it out. What I've learned is that in the video production process and just creativity in general, you can't force yourself into that specific workflow or any real specific workflow. So what I've found is now I've got like half a dozen videos that are at various stages in production at any given time. Sometimes I'll start working on one and get bored with it or hit a wall, either creatively or from a research perspective, like, where am I going to go with this? I can't find any more that explains this one question that I had or whatever, and I'll drop it for a little while and focus on something else. And then in the process of working on another video, maybe I'll come across the answer that I was looking for. Or I'll come across some nugget of information that sparks the idea for a whole new video in and of itself. So I've got it all over the place where a video could take me a week, or a video could literally take me 4 or 5 years, just off and on working on. And so research just kind of comes along the way. I'll start to write a script, and maybe I'll be like, okay, so I'm saying this, but why? Like, why did it end up like this? If I say something like a product was really popular, well, why was it popular? I can see from this magazine article that says they sold however many units of it, and it's the most popular thing, but what was it that people liked about it? So you kind of let the stories that you're reading lead further research, and you go from there. And sometimes you reach a dead end and you don't know why. And so you either backtrack and maybe cut that part out, or you just use your best judgment and just say, I couldn't find information about this, but it seems like this is the way it was, right? You kind of use logic to fill in the gaps as best you can in the narrative. So research just, it's all over the place. What helps about the era of retro tech that I cover is that I lived through it. So in a lot of cases, definitely not all of them, but in a lot of cases, I've got some recollection to kind of help me. Like an episode I did recently was about the LS-120 SuperDisk floppy drive technology. And it competed with the iOmega zip disk in the mid to late 90s. And I definitely remember SuperDisk being an absolute flop. And it was. And another thing that I remember was there was kind of this second wind to the format. Like they launched it and it didn't really go anywhere. And then a couple of years later, Apple released the iMac, the very first one. And suddenly all these people, because it didn't include a floppy drive, wanted to buy a floppy drive to go with the iMac. And because, iMation, the company that made the SuperDisk, had already come out with a USB version of its drive, they had effectively floppy drives sitting on the store shelves. They weren't predicting the iMac to come out. They just happened to already have it. So they put two and two together, realize, hey, wait a minute, like our special floppy drives are backward compatible with regular floppy disks, and our drives already do USB, which is what the new iMac needs. Quick, make more of those drives in that cool blue translucent color so that it matches the iMac. And they ended up actually selling a decent number of those drives. The sad thing, and this is what I also remember from having lived through that era, is that practically no one used the drives for the special SuperDisk floppies. They just bought them because, yeah, it's a floppy disk. It reads the floppies I already have, and it matches my iMac, which looks cool. So they bought it. So it's like, it's some of that kind of stuff you can't really find, hard printed material about. I'm never going to find a magazine article that says, but the majority of people that bought these only bought them to use them as a regular floppy drive. But because I worked at a computer store during that era and sold those drives, I knew the vast majority of people coming in to buy them, only needed to use them in a certain way. So you can kind of extrapolate your own experiences to help flesh out the story, I guess. But what's really neat is just because of the way the internet works and various projects out there like the Internet Archive and that sort of thing, we've got access to a lot of printed material from previous decades too. So you can't find necessarily everything, but if you're good at doing searches and if you know how to look through research journals and that sort of thing, you can generally find something that can lead you down the right path of getting the answer that you need for whatever topic it is you're trying to research.
Awesome, cool stuff. Yeah, I think that part you brought up about like having lived through a lot of this, or at least knowing somebody who's lived through it, like that to me oftentimes is the most impactful, right? Like I hear, like for example, my father-in-law, he ran a game store for a while, right when Magic the Gathering first dropped.
Okay.
And by his telling of the story, the guy showed up. He's like, "Listen, you need to buy this," and he was like, I don't know. It doesn't seem so cool to me. He's like, "Listen, I'm going to sell you two of them. All right, I'm going to sell you these. I'm going to come back. They're all going to be out, and you're going to call me in 2 days." And sure enough, they sold out immediately after he brought them in, and he had to call the guy back and ask for more. And like that kind of story really, it brings a lot of that like enormity and just how big of a deal this was at the time. That just like looking at numbers and saying, "Oh yeah, this sold 5 times as many as the next card game," that you don't get that context. So
yeah, especially it's really nice if you can get in touch with someone who was like a subject matter expert at the time, who was involved, in maybe bringing a product to market or something like that. It's a luxury that I don't get very often at all. Because sad to say, the way technology worked in the 90s was kind of that fail fast type of mentality, where, the people like the engineers and the product designers and stuff, like they were pulling all-nighters all the time, try to rush this thing to market, get it out, and then maybe the product comes out and it's a flop, and then the company lays them off or something like that, so they just get real bitter. I've found a lot of the people that worked in tech decades ago are still around and still active on the internet, but sad to say, just because of their experience from back then, they don't necessarily want to revisit some of those memories. Some of them do. And when that happens and I can talk to them, it's the coolest thing, because now you've got an authority, but they'll also tell you all sorts of just crazy stuff you never knew, right? They're filling in all the gaps. Hey, I always wondered why it was. Tell me why it was the way this thing, why did this product have this weird feature? And they'll go off about, oh, well, my coworker, blah, 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 liked having it that way. And he convinced my boss that we should include it, even though I thought it was a bad idea. And, and they'll just, it brings a lot of humanity to these stories. And that's really kind of, at the end of the day, what a lot of it is about. It's, you've got the nuts and bolts of the technology itself, but ultimately it's humans that create it and it's humans that use it. And so you got to look at those connections, and sometimes the creating and the using, they match up perfectly, and that makes a product successful. And sometimes they don't. And those stories I actually find a little bit more interesting. Why did this thing flop? What was their thought process? And if you can figure out why they thought something was the way it was, but the market was completely different, that can lead to some really fascinating stories.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think that human element is one of the most interesting things. That's one of the things I appreciate most about when I was in college. The head of my department was really about, he'd bring in people who had worked on all sorts of things across a ton of different industries, all related to tech, and just like that human element in the stories is so much more important than you think. And that's where all the fun stories really are. Like an example in the car community, this is one of my favorite stories, is when Ford merged with Aston Martin, the British car company. Mm-hmm. And Aston Martin, they came out with which one was it called? Oh, I'm probably gonna forget the name on it. But anyway, had a V12 engine, super sporty car, long nose, 2 doors. The doors opened weird, one of those really fancy cars. And the joke is that, my goodness, I would never pay that much for 2 Ford Tauruses, because what they did is they took the Ford Taurus block and they just smashed them together. They welded
Put two together.
6
plus 6 is 12. Yeah,
called it a V12. Yeah. Oh, so it's always the fun stuff like that in design. Like, those stories are going to way outlast probably even the technology itself. That's where all the fun.
Well, and it gives the technology some character too, right? Because, you think about like all the boring technology that we have, like some of it's kind of exciting, but you think back at it and you're like, it's just this thing that does this thing. It's nothing that's exciting to it. But sometimes you'll get something that's really out there and really special, even though it may do kind of a normal thing, but there's just something else about it that, like, you can tell there was somebody on the design side who either had a sense of humor or had some kind of crazy idea in their head that just made that one thing a little bit special in one way or another. And those are the stories that end up getting told over and over again. It's not so much about they made this thing and it did well, but then it got obsoleted and now no one thinks about it anymore. It's the weird stuff. It's the stuff with character, I guess you could say. And those are the fun ones to explore. And I feel like there's still a ton of stuff out there with character still to explore.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, I got it's like a classic thing with cars too, is that like, there's one guy who has a YouTube channel called Doug DeMuro, and he's always about the quirks and features of a car, right?
Quirks
the
and features,
the better.
Yeah.
And so all these cars that are quirky and weird and weird that nobody bought, that people are suddenly wanting to purchase, and the prices are going up. So it's been really interesting to see, like, those quirks are kind of more of a selling feature nowadays than when it first came out. Obviously, like, people go for them.
Oh yeah, you look at, and it's true, I think, in any sort of collecting, especially cars, but also tech. There's this particular, I think there were 2 different models of ThinkPad from the mid to late 90s. The cheapest one that I've seen sell on eBay was something like $1,800, which is no, it's even weirder. It's this thick, and I'm totally blanking on the model number now. But what makes it special is it doesn't have an Intel processor in there. It has a PowerPC chip. So it was sold in just minuscule numbers. They treated it more like a mobile workstation. Most of them didn't run Windows. They ran a flavor of Unix. And it was generally, I think, meant to be used by server admins who normally worked on, big Unix servers from IBM, but they needed something portable that ran the same OS that their servers did. And so they didn't sell very many of these. And because that processor that they used at the time, I don't think was really meant for mobile use, it ended up making the thing, huge like a brick, and battery life was bad. And, they had to worry about cooling and that sort of thing. But it's just this really, really weird couple of models. And so because they're scarce, but also have just this really interesting story to them, they sell for a ton of money. And it's the complete opposite of kind of what you would expect. You would think, wow, that was this really weird niche thing that nobody used. Why would I want that? But it's that history of it. And I think to some extent kind of bragging rights too. The people that pick those up, they're the ones immediately showing up on the internet with, oh, look what I just got, and showing it off and trying to restore it and that sort of thing. And I think it's cool in the end, as long as that tech gets preserved and restored and carried forward, especially the more rare that it is. But it's just, kind of the complete opposite of what you would think. But at the same time, seeing that stuff popped up can sometimes kind of draw some people out of the woodwork. You'll get the old, the graybeard from back then, who will see it on the internet and chime in, hey, I had one of those back then, and here, let me tell you some things about it, because they still remember. And it's the kind of stuff that wouldn't have been in the owner's manual or whatever that you can find, online anymore. So that's the neat thing about just this community that kind of develops around really any sort of collecting. And the internet has only made that easier. And I'll even see that in the comments of some of my videos, where I'll do a video about a particular product. And several times now, I've had in the comments someone chime in and say, I was on the design team for that. Here's some other details. Or, you got that part right, but here's, this other part is what we told everybody was the case about that product, but here's the real story and that kind of stuff. And you get like inside information. That's the part that's really cool, is it can kind of draw the community together, and you can learn and get more information back out there. Stuff that just would never have made it out back when it was new. You've got people with just the passage of time, and maybe the company's just completely gone, or no one cares about the product anymore. Some of them don't want to revisit that time, but other ones feel like they can speak freely about it. And so now we're starting to get the real story behind some of this tech. And that's really fulfilling.
Oh, definitely. Without a doubt. I like going through the top stuff for some of your comment sections, just because there's it seems like a lot of people who they're still interested in this sort of stuff, so they find your videos like, oh yeah, that's right, and it's just a really great like moth flame for attracting those types of
well, and it's crazy too, just some of the connections that you can make there. My favorite story is, even before I started creating YouTube videos, I was interested in, retro laptops to some extent, especially ones from Apple, like old Macs. And this was probably 15 years ago. I decided there was this one model of laptop that Apple produced in 1997 called the PowerBook 2400. They only sold it in the US, but primarily in Japan. And it was a really small laptop. It was meant to be what they call a sub notebook. So kind of like your X61, right? Really compact, super portable, but still fairly powerful. It wasn't wimpy like a netbook or whatever. But they were really uncommon in the US. And I figured, you know what? I've always wanted to experience one of those. I never got to see one when it was new. I've got a little bit of money to spend. I'm going to go find one. And I ended up on some mailing list full of people who had that model. And it was kind of active. Maybe someone would post to it once a week or something like this. This is how old school it was. This was an email mailing list. This wasn't a Facebook group or anything like that, right? So I joined this mailing list and I send an email out and I'm like, hey, I'm interested in picking up one of these. Does anyone have a spare one, or are you looking to get rid of yours? And a guy emailed back. He said, yeah, I'm kind of done tinkering with mine. I've got 2 of them. One of them works great. The other one is a parts machine, but they're both in physically good condition. And, we cut a deal and I paid him and he shipped them over. And they were actually both in great shape. And interestingly enough, the parts machine worked fine. So I'm like, okay, whatever. And I never bothered to wipe the hard drives on him because I didn't really find any personal information. He didn't reload the OS. He didn't do a clean install or anything. So there were still some programs and stuff left on there, but he deleted all of his documents. So I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to bother. It's fine, right? There's nothing personal on here I need to worry about. I'm not going to end up doxing the guy accidentally. So whatever. Fast forward, I decide to finally do a video for YouTube about that model. And I tell the story and I fix up the parts machine, which had some cosmetic damage to it, just a little bit like on the lid. And then I kind of spent a couple of minutes talking about, well, it looks like this one was used by someone who was kind of into programming because it had a copy of this software that was really common back in the day for writing programs for Macs. And this other one actually was able to dual boot the Mac OS and Linux, which was not very common back then. And, so I'm kind of interjecting a couple of little bits of detail about these specific machines. Like a month later, and I had totally forgotten about the guy I bought these from. I couldn't even find any of the original emails. He finds the video and comments, hey, I think those were my machines. I think I sold those to you. And then he asked a question about the machines that I didn't answer in the video. Like, did one of them have this one thing on it? And I'm like, dude, it's how did you find me? How did you find this? And he was able to answer, kind of give me a little bit more of the background on the machines. Yeah, I was a college student at the time learning programming or something like that. And that's why I had that software on there. And I was tinkering around with, learning Linux and that sort of thing. And he said the one that he thought was a parts machine, he thought he had killed some of the ports on the back because he accidentally hot plugged an accessory, which you shouldn't do back then. And he's like, oh, and then the computer turned off right away and I thought I killed it, so I didn't worry about it ever again. And turns out it must have been fine, and all that. And it's just like the small world, you know what I mean? Like the guy got out of that model and just randomly later decides, oh, I'm kind of curious about that thing that I had 15 years ago or whatever, and finds my video, and it happens to be the exact ones that he used to own. So that's what's really cool. Just being able to make those connections and the community and it's just, you learn so much and you make a ton of friends doing it. Especially if there are people nearby, that you can meet in person, or groups that you can join, either forums or Facebook groups or whatever, where you can, it's not just you asking kind of anonymously into the void and hoping that the answers come back are correct, like on Reddit or whatever, you're just kind of hoping that the people there are giving you the right info. What's really cool about just collecting, and I know it's the same way with cars and other stuff too, is you eventually kind of establish relationships with these other people and you can all learn from each other. And I think that's just as much fun as it is working on the actual technology.
Oh, definitely, without a doubt. And for something that's, relatively niche, like retro computing space, like it feels like it's just so much easier to find people in it, just because of, the saturation you get in the community is just huge in comparison to some other stuff that you could get into. So that's awesome. All right, let me see here if I've got any. Oh, yes. So I'm curious, do you have a favorite version of Linux to slap on like retro machines?
No, and that's because I honestly don't really use Linux in my personal life. I manage modern Linux servers at work. But the thing is, and I'm going to get so much crap for saying this. Nobody really uses Linux. Like, we all use Linux because that's what our phones and everything run on. Like, every single person who has some sort of electronic device owns something that runs Linux under the hood. But practically no one, in the grand scheme of things, uses Linux as their primary OS. Sad to say. So I like to go for period accurate in generally. If it's a Windows PC, sometimes I like to troll people by putting Windows ME on there, but usually it's just whatever the machine originally shipped with. My favorite thing is to try and find like the original restore media, if that's possible, which often isn't the case. But a lot of times, then you can get the extra software that came with it. Sometimes it'll include like special wallpapers or screensavers that are the brand of the computer or whatever, and just kind of give you that, what was it like brand new out of the box kind of a feel. And I think that plays more into the nostalgia than anything else. But, I like that, trying to stay period accurate. Every once in a while, I'll delve into trying to do kind of the resto mod type of thing, where you put modern parts or, upgrade parts or whatever into a machine to see how far you can push it. And that can be fun, especially if the machine maybe is a little bit more commodity. That's a way to kind of spice up something that's otherwise a little bland. But yeah, I just don't really get into the whole Linux thing. I mean, I know it and I use it, but my daily driver is a Mac for the most part, just because it's kind of the lowest common denominator across all the different things that I do. And I manage, Windows systems as well. And I just go with what kind of feels right instead of doing something really weird and esoteric, I guess.
Definitely. Yeah, I feel yeah, because I have I just threw like Linux Mint onto the ThinkPad when I was running through it, and it's kind of with a lot of these retro stuff, it's a situational use kind of machine anyway, right? I'm not going to be
right
using this probably for my daily browsing. I use it as a bit of a writing machine because it's got a little Wi-Fi thing I could turn off. It's completely insulated, with a manual
That's
switch.
really popular these days. Yeah, even I've seen even people who aren't necessarily into retro tech get curious about retro machines just for that same reason, like for writing, or journaling or whatever, because of the no distractions. The computer's too old or whatever to really kind of get on the modern internet. So you're not constantly wanting to be like, okay, I'm going to take a break for this and get on Twitter for a while. It's just like, I can't get on Twitter because the thing can't do it. And so you're forced to focus. Yeah, if you have a very specific task, Linux can be a great choice for that. But I think the average person, and I don't want to throw the Linux community under the bus, but all the different distributions don't really do Linux a favor, right? Like, if you know how to use Windows, you know how to use Windows. If you know how to use a Mac, you know how to use a Mac. But there can be such differences between all the different Linux distros because they've each gone off and done their own specific thing because they want to customize it exactly how they want. Unless you find that specific distro that is exactly the same, mindedness as you find some other community that has the same focus as what you have, you can just try all sorts of different distros and never really get to where you want. And then no matter which distro you pick, it's the wrong one to someone else. So it's just, and that's just computing. Humans are always wanting to get back into tribalism. What they're a member of is the right thing, and what you're a member of, if it's different, that's the wrong thing. And it's just, you see it across everything, right? Ford versus Chevy. How long has that been a thing? It's completely irrelevant. The trucks work the same, right? It doesn't really matter which one you buy, and you didn't buy the wrong one, whichever one you bought, but they make it a thing. So I just kind of go with whatever is most comfortable for me to use. For retro tech that I'm just not going to use very often, if really hardly ever, then I just go for the period accurate kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm definitely there. I think that's probably what I'll end up doing with the ThinkPad once I get through it. It's just because you lose a little bit of that if you don't have we have like a dinosaur Toshiba satellite laptop when I was a kid that we'd play like Hoyle word games on or whatever,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And so we'd pop it open, and it's like Windows 95. It's trailing the cursor. The thing's dead slow, right? And if it didn't have Windows 95, I don't know. I'm not really getting the experience of having that machine. So I think you're right. You kind of you have it for nostalgic purposes. You might as well.
Well, there's a big difference too. Like with stuff that's truly retro, bad performance can be as much part of the experience as everything else, right? Like this thing was a dog when it was brand new, and it's still a dog now, but that's the way it was. So maybe you have an appreciation for that. Where Linux can be really beneficial is trying to extend the life of semi-modern computers. So an organization here in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul metro area, Free Geek Twin Cities, that's what they do, is they take in donations of just technology. And they're obviously not going to get brand new stuff, because why would people donate brand new stuff? So what they end up getting a lot of are like corporate computers that are off lease or that are just too old to really use for daily use anymore. They're like 4 or 5 years old, maybe 6. They're starting to feel a little slow. A lot of those they'll put Linux on, and because Linux can have lesser hardware requirements, now they fly, right? And Linux can be as easy to use, but there's still some learning curve to it. It's not the exact same as Windows. So there's pros and cons to it. I don't think Linux on truly retro machines, I think that's still very niche. But for more modern stuff, Linux has a lot more applications for sure.
Oh, definitely. Awesome.
All right. So I hope that made the Linux community happier by me saying it that way.
It's got to massage it, towards
I'm not trying to trash talk Linux. It's a fantastic OS, and it's clearly like the most popular one just because of how pervasive it is in society. I mean, your phone runs it, your car probably runs it, all this kind of stuff. But some people say it is the end all be all of everything and no one should ever need Windows and all that. And that's my take. Kind of comes back to the Ford versus Chevy thing. Like, okay, that's great. You've got it working the way you want it to work and doing what you need it to do, but that's not the only way to do it. And so I think that's kind of the downside sometimes that you can get with collecting and, in retro circles is the community as a whole may have this big interest in something, but then now you've got, the warring factions or whatever within it, like you've got the people who are, the diehard, Windows fanatics and the diehard Mac fanatics. And guys, it's all retro. Who cares? The computers are 30 years old. They're not useful for anything modern anyway. Let that go. But sometimes they still kind of butt heads and, and joke about and that sort of thing. So it's old habits die hard, I guess. I remember that being really bad, in the 90s, just the trash talking about different OSs. And I mean, the Windows fanatics got on the Linux people too, because they didn't understand it. It seemed like a threat, just like the Mac seemed like a threat. And so kind of everyone was at everyone else's throats and calling each other names and all that. And
old school, man, PlayStation versus Xbox.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Intense.
Right. It never ends. And it still is. It's still PlayStation versus Xbox. Yeah. It's just, let it go, guys. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'm about to say, like, it really feels like I feel like at some point there probably was a big enough gulf between some of these that, arguing over little qualities maybe made sense, during the PS2 and Xbox 360 maybe. But I feel like once you get past a certain point, they're all just computers now. There kind of was a bit of a difference before.
Especially modern consoles. They literally are computers, right? I mean, yeah, it's... the thing is, people don't realize it's not a zero-sum game. Humans, I think, are kind of wired to turn everything into an us versus them. And for us to win, they have to lose. And this is not just tech. This is life, right? This is literally all day, every day, everything in our lives. We're dealing with this, and that gets just really old, especially when you can just see it going on. It's like they're arguing about nothing. Like, why are those two people arguing about like, let's guys, you don't need to argue. Stop. Like, it doesn't matter. But they still, oh, they've got to prove their point and prove that they're right or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I think that's something we're getting over with retro. The nice thing that I'm also seeing about retro, and like, you know, when I got my start with gaming, you know, getting into retro gaming, it gave me an excuse to explore stuff that I never had before. That may have been stuff that back in the day, I would have been like, oh, I don't want that because that's a different brand than the brand that I like, you know, and it would have been like that black and white us versus them back then. But now, kind of with the passage of time and people get more mature and all that, now you kind of go back to it with, you know, a fresh mind and fresh eyes and can be like, you know, I didn't like that back then, but I'm going to give it another shot. And maybe those people do, and they go, you know, this was actually pretty good. Why didn't I buy one of these back then? Why did I buy, you know, the thing that I bought? And it's nice because it kind of fosters understanding, you know, not just about the history, but also about kind of the rationalizations that we've made in all of our decisions and whatnot. And it helps bring the community together, you know, even better. Maybe you were a diehard, you know, whatever user back then, and a friend of yours was, you know, the other platform, and turns out you had something to learn from each other all along. So it's neat, the opportunities that you can get once it's not real. There's nothing really at stake, right? I think that's where like the Xbox versus PlayStation battles, even today, really kind of come into play. Is people are worried, okay, if I buy the PlayStation, what if the Xbox wins this generation? We're long past that, right? Like, you know, you're going to be worried that you're stuck with the console that doesn't have any of the good games. Well, I wouldn't worry about that so much. But yeah, with retro, doesn't matter.
For sure. Yeah, you get past a certain point, and it's just kind of, oh, I remember those, even if I hated them back in the day. Those things are awesome now. So
yeah,
awesome. All right. Well, I don't want to take too much of your time, so I got one last question here that I'll roll. Now we're on our hour here. So, this one's related to your YouTube channel and your content, kind of in general. So your videos kind of, they have what kind of looks like a pretty high effort level and production value compared to a lot of content that's around. And I'm curious if you've ever like been tempted to try to jump and try a different format, or if you've found different ways to kind of support keeping up the higher effort level compared to, you know, easy content that cranks today, you know, React videos, that sort of stuff like that. If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I look at it in two ways. One is I want to create content that's what they call evergreen. Stuff that anyone can go back to years later and watch and not need to understand the context in which that video was made. So like a reaction video, like that's all going to be meme kind of stuff, right? And if you watch it a month from now, you're barely going to remember what that video was even about. Like, why are they making such a big deal about it? I don't remember what that was that one thing that everyone got a big deal about for 15 minutes and then we all forgot, right? So the evergreen videos is stuff where I want to have this body of work that someday, years, decades, whatever from now, people can go back to and be like, okay, I learned something from that, you know, and it's not just entertainment. There's some education there. There's something of substance there. I don't want to just waste people's time by letting them tune out. I do think that's an important part of any content creator's job, is you have to keep in mind that people watch your work because they want a distraction from something else. In some ways, it's because they have nothing better to do, or because maybe something's going on, right? Maybe they're not feeling well. Maybe something bad happened to them. Maybe something's bad happening to the world and they need to tune out. They want to focus on something else for a while. And so creating this kind of evergreen content that's totally abstracted away from current events. And you don't need to know what's going on behind the scenes in the video other than just what's being shown. I think that's really important because it lets people escape. And it honestly, it helps creators escape trying to make that stuff, right? It gives you something else to focus on other than current events and the state of the world and all that. Yeah, there are ways that I could come up with easier content, easier in quotation marks, where I could still do that. And every once in a while I've done that. Where I'll take a simpler topic and maybe not really dig into the history of it. It's just kind of a, hey guys, here's this thing that I found. Let's take it apart. Let's see how it works. Just tinker with it or whatever. One video that I was really surprised at how popular it became, although I probably shouldn't be surprised, is I just built a retro PC in one video. I think it was last year. Free Geek Twin Cities had amassed over the years a whole bunch of new in-box retro parts. The whole premise of the video was, you know what, everybody, let's just hang out and put this thing together. And I'll show you all the parts that we've got. And I'll talk about them. Maybe some of these are ones that I remember from back then because it was all late 90s kind of stuff. And I worked at a computer store during that time. So I remember a lot of those parts and I can say, oh yeah, this one was really popular. This one wasn't, and that sort of thing. And it was just, don't worry about the history. Don't worry about the research. Just kind of a hangout video. The thing ended up being like over an hour long. So I wouldn't necessarily call it low effort. But it was lower effort in that I didn't have to script it. I didn't have to do research for it. It was just press record and let's just hang out and do stuff kind of thing. And I do those every once in a while. I don't do that more often just because I've got so much stuff on the back burner that I want to keep working through that are some of those more historical kinds of things. Because the other nice thing about the community is you get people wanting to help you. Maybe someone has a rare thing and they know it's a rare thing, but they don't know the history behind it. And they want other people to know the history behind it. So they'll offer to loan it to me, for some period of time. So I can create a video about it and, maybe fix it up if it needs it, or I'll buy it from them or whatever. It's just, I kind of found myself ending up doing a lot of those high effort videos just because that's kind of what I'm known for, and it just keeps going that way. I have been trying to streamline the workflow to reduce the amount of effort. I mean, nothing will make a script take less time to write, but in terms of, filming or editing or whatever, a lesson that I learned kind of the hard way several years ago was, money can't buy time, but money can save time. So my channel is just a part-time thing for me. I still have a day job and that's how I pay my bills. But the meager earnings that I make off of my channel, I just put back into the channel. So it allows me to buy like production equipment that works better with me. I'm not fighting with some janky old camcorder or whatever. I'm able to use a camera that's meant to work and not put up a fuss and do exactly what I want so I can get through filming faster. Or to buy a faster computer that lets me edit quicker without having to wait so long while stuff happens, or tools, buy better tools. I was able to finally buy a desoldering iron, which is really good for like doing capacitor replacements, because it's basically a soldering iron with a hole in the middle and then a vacuum pump. So it heats up the solder and then sucks it out all in one motion. And that's like way faster than doing it the hard way, by hand with an iron and desoldering braid and all that kind of stuff. So I don't want to call them shortcuts, but it's just trying to improve efficiency that I found, helps me maintain that balance between day job work, life, and YouTube, and still try to keep some time left there for life.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Yeah, well, I definitely appreciate that. And I think that's probably I think that's probably a strength to you more than anything else is that you're able to, it's a part-time job for you, right? You don't have to do this to pay the bills. You don't have to worry about all the
Mhm.
efficiency and making enough off a channel um, to keep up an income stream or something like that. And I think that's a huge strength for just kind of that evergreen content type that you're talking about. I think that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to stay at arm's length from that grind. I totally understand the YouTubers who want to make that be their full time job. And they absolutely deserve all the success that they get from doing that. But I think a lot of people underestimate just how much work goes into doing that. I mean, they're just constantly working 7 days a week. I mean, there's one channel that I watch, automotive channel called Sarah Intuned. She's getting close to 1 million subscribers, which is awesome for her. She just never stops. She creates a new video every 3 days, and she's doing like full on auto restoration kind of stuff. She just finished rebuilding, I think it was like a 1968 or 69 Volkswagen Beetle. Repainted the whole thing herself. Just like the level of detail that she goes into with these cars is just insane for the amount of time that she has to work on them. And she does almost all the work herself. Every once in a while, she'll get a little bit of help from someone when she needs an extra set of hands or whatever. But she's kind of, made it clear in some of the videos that she's just exhausted. And it's like, and everyone tells her, just take a break, take a week off. What the hell? And she's just so worried about like the YouTube algorithm, affecting her channel. Like if she takes a week off, suddenly now they're going to stop recommending videos and now she can't grow her channel even more and that sort of thing. And that's just the way it is, for anybody who's trying to make a living on YouTube. Until you get to that point where you're like an MKBHD or somebody who's got just millions of subscribers and you've got people who you are now employing who do a lot of that work. Linus Tech Tips is another great example. Linus himself, he could take 2 weeks off. Doesn't matter. He's got other people who could fill in for him, right? People will still watch the videos. Unless you get to that point, if you're still doing everything by yourself, man, it's a grind. And I've got a lot of respect for the creators who do that sort of thing. But at the same time, I just don't want to become one of them. If the algorithm decides to, knock me down a peg because I want to take a week off or whatever, fine. Doesn't bother me. I'm not doing it for fame or fortune or whatever. It's really just, I enjoy it. I enjoy getting these stories out there and really just hearing from people, their thoughts about it. Their, like hearing from the people who used to work at companies and stuff, getting more stories, knowing that the work is being appreciated. That's enough for me.
Gotcha.